you described this sort of decade-long period, really at its most intense, that the crack epidemic really hit urban America super hard. And that's a really long time, right, for people to be under siege by a substance and then by the government's response to the substance.
The Four Degrees to the Streets podcast explores neighborhood design and urban policy topics through the critical lens of equity to give listeners the tools needed to overcome structural and institutional barriers and examines how the built environment shapes communities for better or worse. Tune in once a month to keep it 4 degrees to the streets. Hey y'all, it's Jasmine. Welcome back to the 4 Degrees to the Streets podcast. I'm here with our guest for the month, journalist, thought leader, and author Donovan X Ramsey. Donovan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jasmine, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So I'm going to jump in by reading Donovan's bio and then we'll get into the questions. Donovan X Ramsey is an indispensable voice on issues of identity, culture, and patterns of power in America. His reporting has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, GQ, Wall Street Journal Magazine, Ebony, and Essence, among other outlets. He has been a staff reporter at the Los Angeles Times, News One, and The Griot. He has served as an editor at the Marshall Project and Complex. Ramsey is the author of When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era, a work of narrative nonfiction exploring how Black America survived the crack epidemic for One World, an imprint of Random House, a division of Penguin Random House. He holds degrees from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and Morehouse College. I'm so excited to have Donovan on the show because as I was reading his book, I was thinking about the relationship between urban planning, policy, and planning decisions and the crack epidemic. And so I wanted to have Donovan on the show to talk about the relationship between the crack epidemic, the war on drugs, and urban policy. The goal of the conversation is to discuss the ways that the crack epidemic impacted cities, examine the consequences of the crack epidemic, and to evaluate the extent to which these issues and outcomes were part of a larger American problem with our systemic racism and systematic structures. For some context on the crack epidemic, it was a period between roughly 1980 and 2000, with the peak between 1985 and 1995 of high crack cocaine use and distribution in the United States. It birthed the war on drugs, which is a series of policies enacted by federal, state, and local elected officials representing both the Republican and Democratic parties. The crack epidemic gave us stereotypes like crackhead, crack baby, and super predator to describe people, mostly Black people, impacted or associated with this substance. It created tougher sentencing for the crack rock than for cocaine powder, although it's the same drug but in different forms. It gave police permission to patrol and harass everyone in any neighborhood associated with the drug. It created mandatory sentencing and punished users of the drug just as severely as dealers, and did very little in the way of substance abuse treatment for addicts. While there are so many TV shows dedicated to the period, HBO's The Wire, Netflix's Narcos, FX's Snowfall as of recent, we know very little about the facts of the crack epidemic and even less about the people who were impacted by crack cocaine. In 2023, our guest, Donovan X Ramsey, released When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era, to do just that. To pull back the veil on the myths and stereotypes of the era. As it reads on the book sleeve, When Crack Was King is a crucial reevaluation of the era and a powerful argument for providing historically violated communities with the resources they deserve. Donovan, thanks for joining the show and thanks for writing this awesome book.
Thank you for having me. That is maybe the best introduction I think I've ever had. You are
Thank
so good
you.
at this.
I appreciate that. Let's go to our first question, the title, When Crack Was King, A People's History of a Misunderstood Era. Let's pull back the curtain a little bit on the title. Who are the people whose history you're telling? What is misunderstood about the crack era? And I think I mentioned this when we were doing the pre-show is I picked up the book in the bookstore and I was struck by the title and the cover. And so there's a city on the cover and it looks like a young man kind of standing on some roof of the building looking down at what looks like some demolition. So talk to us about the cover, the title, and everything like that.
I'm happy that all of that caught your eye because I fought very hard for the title. I fought very hard for the cover. And I love the way that they came out. So, for me, I wanted to present this story as epic as it actually was. I mean, you described this sort of decade long period, really at its most intense, that the crack epidemic really hit urban America super hard. And that's a really long time, right, for people to be under siege by a substance and then by the government's response to the substance. So I knew it was an epic story that also had its beginnings far before the substance ever hit, that sort of incubation phase, and that has continued to um, sort of spin out the sort of ripples, the what I call the residue of the crack epidemic, which still lingers. So when crack was king for me, the sort of language of that gestured towards a period of time where something important happened. And I took the king language from um, a phrase called King Cotton to describe the period of enslavement in this country, where that substance cotton was so important. So people used to say that cotton was king. So for me, there was a time when in urban America, crack was king, where it changed the trajectory of people's lives. It made people a fortune, and it devastated others. Um, in thinking about the subtitle, People's History of a Misunderstood Era, that was also a nod to Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, which sort of deconstructs American history and rewrites it from the perspective, right, of those of us who don't really get stories written about us, and that is the maligned and the marginalized in this country. That those are the people, and in this particular instance, those people are my people. They are Black folks, oftentimes Latino folks living in urban centers. They are the children of enslavement and migration and bad public policy, who were impacted by what happened. To illustrate that point for the cover was a struggle. Ooh, it was a struggle, Jasmine. We didn't know. Well, you know what? I knew what I wanted it to feel like, but actually finding images that fit that were difficult because, the most obvious thing, and that's something that, the cover designers played around with, was to actually use the substance, right? To put crack, pictured, an image of crack cocaine on the cover. That didn't work for me because the story isn't about the substance, the story is about people. So I don't want to put, the substance first. So that was the first fight. The next fight was to use potentially archival images of people at the time. But then we ran into the problem of most of the archival images were of people in distress. It was people strung out. It was people being arrested. And for me, those kinds of moments of distress in in my people's lives are interruptions, really, in the way that they otherwise live their lives, even if they are dealing with substance abuse and addiction. So I wanted an image that reflected the era and that moment in a person's life where the worst thing hasn't happened yet, or maybe the worst thing already happened, and you're in that in between. So that's how we ended up with an image of a young man on the roof of a building looking out over his city as it is in this moment of challenge and change. And I think that hopefully that is leading enough to sort of stoke people's interest in what's in the book.
And the image is striking because I'm wondering what's going through his head, right, as he's looking out and at his city and the people who live there, and everything that they're going through. And I think landing at this as opposed to an image of the substance or an image of people, especially people in distress, because there's a lot of joy in this book, and there's a lot of this book, and even in that title that I read, that so how Black America survived this
Hmm.
time period. I don't think that showing images of people in distress is indicative of that survival and that joy that we were experiencing simultaneously while going through this time period.
Absolutely. And there's one more sort of small kind of choice that I made, which is that the title of the book on the cover is a particular color, and that is it's the actual color of crack cocaine, which is sort of an off-white. So that was the nod to the substance, was in the color of the actual letters. But that was sort of a if you know, you know, a nod to the people in recovery, the people who saw crack firsthand. It was a very minor thing to let them know that I really did my reporting.
Your book follows a series of people, a set of characters, four people: a former addict, Lenny; a former dealer, Sean; the son of an addict, and who dealt a little bit also, Elgin; and then the 47th mayor of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, who was the mayor from 87 to 99. Kershmoke was one of the early proponents of legalization of cocaine and advocates to approach the crack epidemic through public health techniques rather than the war on drugs. Throughout my life, I hadn't really heard of this period in the 80s and 90s as the crack epidemic, but rather the crack era. And I think something about calling it an epidemic, especially after we've all just gone through the COVID-19 pandemic, brings a sort of public health lens to the time period that calling it an era doesn't really capture. Why did you find it important to include the mayor's story in your book? And what would it kind of been like if we did choose a public health approach as opposed to a criminalization approach?
So it was so important for me to insist on the frame of an epidemic because that's truly what it was. It was this public health event that hit a generation of people within certain communities all across the country, right, simultaneously. So, just describing it as an era, it does this trick. It has this trick effect where then people who were impacted during the era, the weight of what happened just falls on their personal responsibility, right? So you fell prey to addiction as an individual in complete isolation with no context, right? And no implications for anybody else. But in reality, when you talk about it as an epidemic, you are understanding the individual impact and, of course, people's agency and choice, but also the larger dynamics that made this possible for, thousands and thousands of people. Maybe, I mean, I would say hundreds of thousands of people. So that's significant. And if you notice, it also that lens using it helped me structure the book. So the book is both written in chapters of individuals' lives, people like Kurt Schmoke, who you mentioned, but also the timeline of the epidemic is marked with the benchmarks of an epidemic. So we talk about the incubation, we talk about the outbreak, we talk about the spread, we talk about the aftermath. That's an important way to talk about those different phases and actually what happened during that moment in time. So to the question of Kurt Schmoke, I knew that I had to have him as a character in this book, Jasmine. So I spent a year in 2018 traveling the country, finding people who were impacted by the crack epidemic. And in popular media, we've seen the epidemic really explored through the lens of the dealer primarily, right? Because that's a story that many Americans appreciate. The young man trying to make a fortune through something dangerous, right? That's the Godfather, that's the cowboy story. That is an American character. But so many other people uh, were impacted during the crack epidemic and had a hand in the crack epidemic. And for me, because it was this sort of public health emergency, I wanted to hear from elected officials and people who were doing that work. So I knew I had to have a an executive. Um, and also something too that was really interesting about that period in time is it was the era of the black mayor, right? So
I mean, having him in there, he had special difficulties as being a black mayor in a black city during this era that America wanted to say was only happening to black people. And so
mhm,
he faced a particular challenge, same as other black mayors in Los Angeles and in Newark and in Atlanta.
absolutely, that all of these major cities had gone through their own uprisings shortly before, maybe a generation before, and the response was they wanted to take control of their cities. So black folks were electing their own to run the cities, and many of those cities, that were impacted got their first black mayors during the period. And Kurt Schmoke was one of those mayors, but he stood alone in that he was really the only one who wanted to talk about what he called medicalization. So he didn't say decriminalization, he didn't say legalization. He said we need to medicalize what's happening. And it's funny how that happens. That he just happened to be a wonk and an absolute nerd, even though he became electable because he was this charismatic guy who had been a football player. So he was popular within Baltimore because he took his high school to state championships as the quarterback, both his junior and senior year. So he built a profile as a young man. He then got recruited to Yale on a football scholarship by Grant Hill's father, who was at Yale at the time playing football. Because he was a great student and very scholarly. He became then a Rhodes Scholar and went to Harvard and Oxford. And then because he had then at that point built this incredible profile, he got recruited to come back to Baltimore and was really put on a path to become the city's first black mayor. In the meantime, he married a black woman who was a physician. So he had the insight of a scholar himself. He had his wife, who was a physician and who was working within hospitals in Baltimore, who was saying to him, we can be a model for how to respond to what's happening all across the country. We have the benefit of an institution like Johns Hopkins, that if any city is going to medicalize, it should be us. So when he was asked during his first year as mayor, what did he think would work? He did what many of us who are policy minded do, which is you just say what you think is the best policy. Politics be damned. That he's like, I think medicalization is the answer. And, once he said it, the cat was out of the bag and he had to stand on it. And he did. It was his approach as much as he could get support for it throughout the rest of his tenure as mayor, which crossed many different terms. But that's Kurt Schmoke's story, and I think it really did ruin his national prospects for politics, but it made him, I think, still today a hometown hero.
He appeared in The Wire as the public health official when I can't remember if it was the police. I think it was the police chief in the Wire or the mayor who wanted to test out this medicalization or legalization of crack cocaine in a certain area in Baltimore, and that was my first time learning about him and learning about who he was. We approached the crack epidemic, the crack era, with like a criminalization approach, right? Criminalizing users and dealers. How do you think some of the outcomes would have been different if we would have used this medicalization or this public health approach?
Mm, that's a great question. I would say that if we had taken a public health approach, we wouldn't be dealing with an opioid epidemic right now. That what we created instead of resources that reduced harm and saved people's lives and then ultimately kept them alive long enough for them to make a decision to get clean. What we created was this criminalization monster that chews people up, that detains them, that puts them in jails where they still have access to drugs, or tortures them while they go through withdrawal, and then spits them back out onto the street to use again. That's what we created. And what we ultimately did through that was we created more harm in people's lives and more devastation. The crack epidemic ended not because of the system that we created, but because of different choices that the next generation of young people made. But that monster, that criminalization monster, still exists, and now it is chewing up a whole different population of people, and it will continue to do that until we replace it with something actually healthy.
I listened to you talk. I think it was an interview that you did in person at Stanford, and you talked about you had a neighbor, I think in New York, that was clearly using opioids, and you mentioned like you would see him outside on the stoop or something, and you realized there was nothing else you could do for him except call the police. There was no other kind of wraparound service or help service that you could assist him with in any other way, and I think that is one of those like personal examples that really highlights how we still to this day have a long way to go in terms of dealing with substance abuse and addiction, particularly when it's a addiction of an illegal substance or what they call a hard substance, because addiction is pervasive across. There's caffeine addictions, there's food addictions, there's pornography addictions, all these different types of addictions. And so to that point, right, I think most people who were close enough to the crack epidemic can see that tough on crime is kind of one of those consequences or residue. That's the word you used earlier. For me, I see a few consequences of the crack epidemic. I'd like to get your take on them. That tough on crime policy is pervasive, right? We still have stop and frisk across New York was a huge thing. The privatization of prisons, mandatory sentencing is still a thing today. Plea deals, and then tougher sentencing just all around, even for non-drug related offenses. There's just as the tough on crime nature is just pervasive across all levels of government and all political parties. That devalued perception of Black people, I think, is something that for me is the saddest. In your book, you write about the crack epidemic advanced in the American imagination the perception of Black people as sick and in need of a firm hand, because of terms like crack baby, which were saying that these kids were going to have these mental and physical and emotional illnesses, and they were going to forever be on the social welfare of the United States government. The imprisonment of a large percentage of the population. People were jailed for drug offenses that grew 10 times from 1980 to 2010, majority of them being Black people. The population of people living in cities declines, right? Bringing down the tax base, which pays for services. After the crack epidemic, we have huge suburbanization in the early 2000s of people just migrating out of the cities, and the United States government providing special financing for developers to build outside of the city. And ultimately, we have the 2008 recession as a result of that speculative development all across suburbs outside of the city. Part of the reason because of this perception of the city was so bad. And then the loss of a whole generation. I think this is something that's hard to put into words, but you have a period of time in which people are using, distributing, and children being and families being impacted by it. And so that breaking down of a family. My grandfather, he talks about his town in New Jersey where he raised his children. And he talks about the crack epidemic as being this kind of wave that ripped through a generation. He remembers, he thinks back to his little league team, and he has said to me on multiple occasions with like this kind of sadness that shows through his eyes of him realizing that more than half of the kids on his little league team were either by the time that they were 18 or 19 years old were using or were selling or have now passed away or are sick or in some way shape or form injured because of this time period. And that for me, uh, it's hard to fathom, right? It's hard to talk about it in concrete terms because it is a sort of damaging or a loss of a generation of people. Um, does any of those do any of those stand out as being more severe? Are there any ones that you would add to that kind of breakdown of the consequences?
I mean, I think that you name them, and it just I want to call attention to really what happened to that generation of people. Um, one of my favorite people that ever existed is Whitney Houston, right? A New Jersey legend, as you
We love
know.
Whitney Houston in New Jersey. We love her so
Absolutely.
much.
Right. So think of how incredible of a person and a talent and a symbol for a certain kind of Black excellence Whitney Houston was. But even she couldn't escape the pressures, right? And also the allure of the era. And then also think about how terribly we treated her, despite how much joy she gave us. All because she was dealing with the sickness that was much bigger than herself. So I think of her really as emblematic of what happened to a whole generation of folks. And when we think about how those people were situated, you talk about your granddad's little league team. Um, what we're really talking about are these children of migration who were denied the promise of migration. So these are, when you think about it, the great migration periods of Black folks moving from the South, oftentimes from um, the Caribbean to the United States, into communities where they were told they would have opportunity to live the American dream, which is to work a good job and retire and put your kids through school and buy a house, right? And what they found instead were uh, red line neighborhoods. They found homes that were hiked up in price that their white neighbors moved out of as soon as they got there. And then the loss of job opportunities, right? Meaningful labor as industrial deindustrialization happened. So that first generation that moved in got to experience some of the promise, but their kids didn't necessarily have access to that. So what happens then is the neighborhoods that had been solid working class neighborhoods became areas of concentrated poverty in many cases. So there's a certain amount of devastation and desperation amongst that next generation of young people where they don't know what kind of job they're going to have, that they're not going to live as well as their parents did. So they start looking to other things. For some people, that was being able to deal drugs to continue to have opportunity, to be able to continue to live the American dream. The average drug dealer didn't become a kingpin and make a ton of money. He was able to, or she was able to buy a car or help their parents out with some bills, be able to go on a nice date, be able to put on, their starter jackets or their Levi's and their Lacoste shirts to look like they were middle class. Um, and then the outcome, right, is that that entire generation of people, whether they're dealing or they are using, they get swept up in often criminalization, and then they get moved out of the community. So then that older generation of folks, the homeowners, the folks that are still looking at retirement, they look around at what had been their dream, right? And it's just devastated. It's like your grandfather looking around at that generation of young people, right? And they wonder who are they going to give their business to? Who's going to take over the house? So they, as a result, and then they have so many painful memories associated with their neighborhood. So as soon as somebody comes knocking on their door saying, I'll give you a certain amount of money and you can move further away, maybe you go back down south. You know what is often the sort of trend? or you move further out into the suburbs, that's how we see that cycle of property loss and devaluation. That's how we see that cycle of gentrification, right? That's how we see essentially um, uh, generation after generation of broken promises. But I worry so much about that lost generation.
The points that you just made are very important because sustainability of a neighborhood comes from being able to new people saying, I like that place. I want to live there. I'm going to choose to start my business in Newark. I'm going to choose to start my business in Baltimore. I'm going to choose to start my business in Asbury Park, New Jersey, as opposed to some other town. But as the crack epidemic is happening and you have crime on the rise, you have over policing, people decide, maybe that's not a good place for me to go. And so then the neighborhood is only left with those who have no other place to go or who have made the conscious decision to stay. And that generation for me is, it's like a gap, right? You have the people who migrated, my grandfather, from Georgia to New Jersey for opportunity in manufacturing. He gives birth to a son in that generation, right? So people born at that period of time are dealing, they're swept up in this epidemic. They give birth to kids. And now there's the gap between the migrants and the children of the crack epidemic, and there's a lot of ground, right, to cover because my grandfather, fourth grade education, manufacturing, hard labor, his son in that generation of children are kind of absent from the workforce permanently, right? Absent from college permanently, or they're going in sporadic. Then you have the next generation who then goes to college and might have more of a professional background, but there's an age gap, right? So at the time that the generation of the crack epidemic, their children become 21 or 22, the parents of the addict are so much older that there's all this ground to cover. There's no way that a 22-year-old can then take over the business or take over the home because you're missing that 50-year-old, but he's either deceased or he's in prison or he's sick to a point where he can't do anything because of his addiction or because of the usage. And so that loss is truly a loss of, it's a missing middle, quote unquote, of people who aren't able to fully participate in society until later on in life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's something that, when these policy decisions were being made, wasn't even a second thought. What does it mean to disappear an entire generation? And how can we respond in a way that keeps families and communities intact, understanding and appreciating the need for that kind of like generational handover, right? And ultimately, what it did was it turned communities against people in the middle, which you just can't have, right? That, like, whether or not they are um, um, struggling with addiction, selling drugs, doing what you want them to do, that the policy has to put them on a path to be contributing members, not just to society, whatever we think of that as, but to communities and to families.
I'm gonna jump to a question because I feel like we're right here at it. I studied planning and policy in both undergrad and graduate school. So I learned about city planning and the decision making that people like Robert Moses and Le Corbusier and different people like that were putting into the profession. The podcast has a 90-minute episode called The History of Racism in Urban Planning, where we go line by line of every policy decision that was made at federal and state levels to shape cities through a lens of racism. And so when I think about the city planning and policy decisions, when I think about what they say about what American institutions, American governments feel towards Black people, it's heartbreaking, right? We used highways to demolish Black neighborhoods legally, right? We're going to say, oh, this neighborhood's blighted. We're going to build I-95 right through the middle of it. In New Jersey, we're going to build 280 right through the middle of it. In LA, we're going to build I-10 right through the middle of it. In Atlanta, we're going to build 285 right through the middle of it. Pick a city, name the highway, that's what it did. We have the siting of hazardous facilities like landfills and waste treatment facilities in Black neighborhoods because the land is deemed as being cheaper, being deemed as being easier. We have restricting Black homeowners from buying in neighborhoods and steering through the Department of Housing. My grandfather bought his house because he heard on a Black radio station that they were building homes that they would allow to be sold to Black people.
Hmm.
That was not every single home subdivision that was being built in the 50s and the 60s was not eligible for Black people to purchase there. And so when he heard on the news that they were building single family homes and they were allowing Black families to buy them, he rushed down there to put his name on the list to be a homeowner. We have public housing facilities being built, not being maintained, and then ultimately being demolished. So when I was reading your book, I was thinking about how the war on drugs and that set of policies is not dissimilar from urban renewal or Hope 6 or redlining or environmental justice. And the theme that emerged for me is Black people being viewed by American institutions as worthless, and as deserving of a slightly lower quality of life. As I see it, there's this perception of Black people, and through extension, the places where they live, as criminal, as sick, as villain, as predators, as unfit for society, as not worthy of a decent quality of life, or at least not worthy of the same level and quality of life as the rest of America. And so the policies that follow from that line of thinking are ones that demolish Black neighborhoods, are the ones that damage the people who live in those places. As I'm preparing for this interview and reading your book, that's just the thought that I've been going through is
Hmm.
how the policies of war on drugs are very similar in the same kind of line of thought that gives us redlining and the Federal Highway Act and Hope 6. I think about the war on drugs as kind of being a similar urban policy of a way that says we want to limit the mobility, the lived experience of Black people, and here's a strategy to do so. That's
Hmm.
me. That's my theory around how these things are related, but I want to get your take on that also.
I mean, I think that you put it beautifully, and I wish I had known you when I was writing the book because I would have had a million questions for you. But there's a reason why this book, the inscription, the dedication, is for the misunderstood, the marginalized, and the maligned. Because writing it really taught me that that is what blackness was designed to be, right? That blackness is that we have made it a culture and a community, and we have made a race of ourselves, but that it was just designed to put us, because of the way that we look and our distance from white culture, to put us the closest to harm. So all of these policies, what they're about is trying to insulate certain people from bad things by putting us in the middle as a buffer. So if a policy is going to be, I mean, if a highway will be built, it'll be built through our neighborhood, right? If someone will be policed, it'll be us. If anybody has to live near the levees, it'll be us, right? That out of all the policies around housing and all of the interventions that the federal government has made in housing, right? That the people who will live in high density, high poverty areas where there are little services to maintain them, and who won't get the fancy suburbs that are subsidized, it's going to be us. That we are meant to carry the weight and the burden of the entire country, and that's the story, city to city. And that's how I think of how those policies are enacted. And it's made me again think differently about blackness. And then all of the stereotype and the judgment then comes later as a way of justifying those policy decisions, right? Which is the interesting thing, is that it's this double whammy that, first we are forced to carry the burden. And then in order to justify, to sort of, clean people's hands policy wise, they then say, oh, well, that's because they are XYZ. Um, and it's a shame because what you really see when you look at the history is that we persevere despite the burden and despite the stigma and the stereotype and the bias, right? That our neighborhoods continue to exist and still create so much wealth and so much beauty because we are hardworking and resourceful and creative and love each other. If we were those other things, we would have died out generations ago. You know that from the earliest policies directed at us around just our enslavement, right? If we were all of those things, then that would have killed us. But we have survived time and time again, space to space, because we have a superpower that no other community has, and that is the ability to look at the person next to you at the bottom of a slave ship and to become cousins, right? To be sold off to a new plantation and to become mother and daughter, right? To sit in a prison and become brothers. That's the thing that keeps us alive, you know? So we deserve better policy because we're also taxpayers, right? Because we also invest into this system that then penalizes us and then underserves us. So we deserve better. And we can look at the history to be able to see time and time again how decisions get made to harm us. So I'm just so happy to have one to be working on the thought side of it, to be able to call attention to these trends in the policies, but also to have people like you, right, who are the fruits of these neglected and maligned and misunderstood and marginalized communities that take all of that knowledge and say, no, I'm going to insist on better housing policy. You know, so that's my 2 cents. Let me stop before I start preaching.
No, it's and I think your point about taxpayers, I'll just double down on that because take a city like LA, and you can take a street like La Cienega, and La Cienega runs from right at the bottom of the West Hollywood Hills and goes all the way down past LAX. And when you drive down La Cienega north and south, you see the built environment change, right? You go from these big, beautiful, clean, tree-lined streets, and all the businesses are open and operating, and people are walking around. And as you keep going further south, as you get closer to LAX, there's less and less palm trees, there's less and less open businesses, but there's the same number of people out walking around and experiencing this place that's missing sidewalks, that's missing bike lanes, that has a road that says the speed limit is 25, but the street is 11 feet wide, and so you can just speed right down it as if it's a highway. And when I talk to people who aren't in the field of planning, who don't work in the built environment, their perception of places like Baldwin Hills or Inglewood or South Central or Manchester and Westchester are that the people that live there want their neighborhood to be like this, that they don't care. Um, and that's not true, right? In any of those communities you go to, there are parents who are actively trying. If you turn down the side street, you'll see signs that say, slow down in our neighborhood, drive like your kids live here. These are not people who don't care. This is the government taking resources that we all pay into and distributing them unevenly across the board, just unevenly distributing transportation resources, housing resources, social services resources, all of those. And that to me
Absolutely.
is the biggest challenge.
It is plunder to tax people, right? To take resources from them and then not to service them. And you know, but because Black folks in particular as seen are not just seen, but you know, we are crafted in the media and in policy to seem as though we are just these drains on the system, and folks who don't contribute, right? We don't get what we deserve out of the system that we invest in. I don't know if you have a question about this, but you know, this is why history is so important to look at, right? Because you can just say in isolation that Black people have a certain culture, a certain beliefs and attitudes that then result in the circumstances of our lives in this country and of our experiences. But that kind of hypothesis demands then that Black people are unchanged over time, right? So that is to say that, 25 or let's say 18 to 25-year-olds today are the exact same as 18 to 25-year-olds in the past and, every generation previously. And we are completely unaffected by the social dynamics around us, right? So, Black unemployment, for example, is typically explained away when it's high as just a result of Black people's willingness to work. We don't take that approach when it comes to the unemployment numbers for any other group, right? So, why are we a people without context, right? Why are we a people with some supposed culture that goes unchanged generation to generation? Doesn't make sense, right? So that sort of cultural lens that came into it really came into popularity after the civil rights era, where people just couldn't say Black people are this by nature, right? Black people are less than and subhuman. So you couldn't say that. So you would just say then Black people have a sick culture. But both don't actually stand up to any type of investigation. I want to talk too, if we can, about what I saw in my reporting about which cities were impacted by the crack epidemic.
Of course, let's do it.
So, it was positioned as a Black problem that happened to Black people. And nobody ever noted that it stopped, right? So, there was a lot of fanfare around Black folks and drugs through the 80s and 90s. And then, as folks that lived in hard hit neighborhoods like me noticed it tapering off, there wasn't the same amount of reporting to say, okay, this stopped. So a part of my reporting was in actually trying to measure the crack epidemic and actually trying to find out who it impacted and where those folks were impacted. And I came across a great piece of research that was done by a guy named Roland Fryer, an economist out of Harvard, who created an index to measure the crack epidemic. So he looked at, you know what an index is, but it is a number of measures that then allow you to measure something bigger. So, for example, he looked at cocaine related overdoses. He looked at cocaine, arrest for cocaine possession. He looked at things like DEA busts, a number of different things that would allow one to say this was the crack epidemic. And then he made a list, a ranked list of cities that were hardest hit. And the top 10, let me say that I think the first three cities were all in New Jersey, which was shocking to me, right? Because when you hear about the crack epidemic or see it pictured in popular culture, it's either Los Angeles or it's New York City. But to see that it was Patterson, Newark, Trenton made me go, oh, there is a missing story here, right, about what happened. But then we also got into cities like New York, like Los Angeles, like Oakland, like Chicago, like Detroit, like Baltimore, like Philly. And I'm seeing this trend in the top 10. One, I'm seeing it's not every Black community across the country. More than half of Black folks in this country live in the South, right? But I'm only seeing a couple Southern cities. I'm seeing Atlanta, I'm seeing New Orleans. But much of the South and much of the Midwest, wasn't as hard impacted. So when I finally get the list and I start, traveling the country in 2018 to all of these places, and I'm reading up on their histories, I'm seeing these were all riot cities in the 60s and 70s, right? That in 67 and then in 68 when Dr. King was assassinated, these cities exploded, right? So now I'm thinking about the kinds of conditions that lend to those kinds of uprising. People mad about the way that they're being policed, people dissatisfied with their housing, people dissatisfied with the lack of opportunity, truly disaffection happening in these communities. Then I'm seeing a level of, again, deindustrialization. So these were also great migration cities that people moved from cities further south to be able to find jobs and opportunity. And then the factories that they went to work at, whether it was airplane factories, right, in Los Angeles. Oftentimes, if it was good city jobs on the East Coast, maybe you got a job for the train system, or you got a job as a teacher, or you got a job working in government often. Those are very common experiences for folks on the East Coast. All the factories that exist around Chicago and places like that, and the auto manufacturing in cities like Detroit, all that goes away in a generation, right? Because of the riots, because of the deindustrialization, you see a level of white flight. So these are places where suburbs are popping up on the outside. So then you see this erosion of the tax base as people that have been there for generations, white folks typically move to the suburbs and black folks are left in the city. Maybe some of those white folks hold on to their property and they maintain those property for black renters that are continuing to move in, which also disrupts, right, how neighborhoods are maintained when you have landlords there who are not also living in the neighborhood. And then we talked about this a little bit earlier with Kurt Schmoke, but then you see the rise of black mayors, often Democrats, right, who are saddled with the soft on crime label, and who then, as a result, have to enact hard on crime policies as a way to combat that, and oftentimes to get state funding for more conservative leaning states. So these are all trends that I saw, right, that have almost nothing to do with the individual decision to use or sell drugs, but that then impact how that decision plays out. I want to fast forward and say that as I was finishing the book and we got to 2020 and the uprisings around George Floyd's murder, I then saw those same cities being the sites of that kind of unrest and that level of disaffection. You know, Dr. King said a riot is the language of the unheard. And I find that to be true. And I think that we can extend that to the crack epidemic and say that the crack epidemic was another kind of expression of people who had been silenced.
And then further silenced by virtue of their association with the substance and their proximity to it also. Yeah, the riot cities and thinking about the timeline, right, of leading up to the 80s and the attempts and the strategies of the civil rights movement that didn't fully materialize, the nullification of our leaders, the murdering of our leaders, the co-opting of our social movements to not have change in America. And then this drug appears that just comes at the right time when people are disaffected and in a down state because of jobs, because of housing, and here's something that provides a quick high, a quick escape. It's cheap, it's affordable, you can get your hands on it relatively easily, to try to soothe their day-to-day pains, whether it's joblessness or underemployment or education challenges. And so it's just one of those periods that I think if you, to the point we were talking about earlier, if America's perception of Black people was more, the best word I can think of right now is more positive, more positive. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really pull it all together. But if the perception of Black America was more positive, I think any other demographic with under the same circumstances, the approach to the crack epidemic would have been different because there would have been that context, right? You said, wow, how come Black people are without context? And I think that's perfectly, I think you said that very well. It's like, if you put it all into context, your approach has to be different because you understand. When you take away the context, you decide on a heavy-handed approach because these people deserve it. The question that I want to ask, and I think is important, especially for our listeners here, is about Black people's, there's a perception of the crack epidemic that Black people were complacent. right, with how their neighborhoods were transforming, with having crack houses, with having crack addicts in their neighborhood. But you talk about the role of community organizations, right, and groups that were coming together to try to protect their neighborhood. What did your research show you about the effectiveness of community organizations in mitigating the neighborhood level damage of the crack epidemic and the cracker? I think you talk about some groups in DC and in Philadelphia. And to me, that struck me as being very important context because it's something that I had never uh,
Mhm.
heard about, talked about. None of those shows speak on this group of people or the elders in the neighborhood, that older generation who were then trying to save their communities. I just want to hear your thoughts on what your research found on those organizations.
I am so happy that you asked me about that, Jasmine, because almost no interviewer focuses on that part. But for me, that was the real um, revelation of the book. Was that, one of the big questions I had going into it was, why did the crack epidemic end? And I expected to get into the policing, to get into the um, media campaigns like the, you know, drug-free alliances and DARE and all of that stuff. But instead, what I happened across was a wealth of research from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So the federal government did studies into trying to answer that question. And there were a series of ethnographies that went into a lot of the cities that we talked about to try to answer the question. And what they came up with was, it was a choice made by the next generation of young people to not use crack in particular. And when those young people talked about what their influences were, they talked about the culture that we created, namely hip hop and the movies, which I would call sort of like hip hop films made by Black directors during the period, but also messaging coming from inside the community, the stuff that they were seeing on the ground, including that sort of neighborhood and community work. So, and if you grew up in a Black neighborhood, if you know older Black people, right, you know that nobody was working harder than that generation of Black folks that were in church, right, and were trying to bring people in and give their lives to the Lord and support them, that were taking care of grandchildren, that were doing neighborhood patrols oftentimes, and that were doing what I call real harm reduction. So we talk about harm reduction in the sense of like needle exchange programs that keep people healthy while they're using. But harm reduction is also sometimes saying, you can sleep on my couch for a week, you know, or I'm not going to call the police, but y'all can't turn this abandoned house in the neighborhood into a crack house because we have children that walk to school past this house. And that kind of stuff typically went underreported, but I saw it time and time again where there was reporting in cities like Washington, D.C., which had a real movement of neighborhood patrol groups that would really push drug dealers out of the neighborhoods. I saw groups like the Nation of Islam that were going into public housing and pushing out drug dealers, that were actually setting up clinics to help people get off of drugs. I saw it in Oakland, where you had doctors and nurses coming together to try to have a public health response. Something a lot of folks don't know is that the current mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, got her start in public life because she had been an emergency room nurse who started a group called, I believe, the Community Alliance. And the first sort of task and agenda that they had was to respond to the crack epidemic as it was happening. So to see that transition of somebody in a city like LA, which really was the epicenter for the crack epidemic, that she got her rise because of the crack epidemic. That was how she got into public life. Um, Folks like Maxine Waters, right, who got down to business when it came to investigating the CIA and FBI's ties to the influx of cocaine into Black communities. We're talking about real grassroots community work that doesn't often get described as such. But for those of us, again, that grew up during that era, we're like, oh, yeah, that's right. There were those gun buybacks. And there were, the people that you would see if you went to a black church that would come in, who maybe were a little bit disheveled. And maybe they came in a few Sundays to, go to the altar and get prayed for. But that's that community work I'm talking about. And we as a group of people do it better than anybody.
I think as we work towards the end, and I hate to end this conversation, my last question for you is, how does America heal and repair the damage of the crack epidemic? A huge question.
Okay, Jasmine. Ooh. That's a big question. I want to first say that this book is for a lot of people. It's for the people who survived it firsthand. And I think that the reason why I wanted to write this book for those people is that they deserve to have their story told and to be a part of our history and to not be erased because of stigma and because of shame. So for those folks, I want to see them climb out from the stigma and the shame of being labeled a crackhead or a crack baby or a super predator because they were never that. So that's the first thing. The book is also for those of us that love those people and that have loved those people, and for and that includes me. I wrote this book because I wanted to reclaim those people as a part of my community, as a part of my family, as a part of my inheritance, because they are. I wouldn't be the person that I am if I didn't have cousins and aunts and uncles who were swept up in that era and what I learned um, from their example and what I learned from them directly about life because they were still teaching me, even though they were impacted and they were dealing with it and being dealt with by the system. So for me, coming to wholeness means reincorporating them into my understanding of myself. I would say, as a society, we have to learn the story, the honest story. I think that my book is a start, but hopefully we can start talking about or freely talking about this epidemic and the way that it impacted our society, put it in its rightful place. And then we have to actually learn from it, right? So we have to start um, talking about people differently. We have to dead that crackhead word. Hate when I hear that. I hate when I'm in some, Whole Foods or at a farmer's market and there's a seasoning that's like, this is the crack everything bagel seasoning. Why are we playing with that language like that? You know what I mean? Like we're not talking about, the sort of oxycontin seasoning. That's not cute. You know what I mean? So why is it cute when it comes to harm that was done to my community and my people? I don't like it. And I call it out every time. I become militant about it, you know? And when we put the epidemic in its rightful place and we understand the context of it and also the consequences of it, I don't think that we'll make jokes like that. That's my hope. And then, I want to see policies that actually honor the complexity of the epidemic. I want, for example, I wrote about and talked about living in Crown Heights and, walking out and seeing this certain man every day, obviously nodding off under the influence of an opioid and me knowing what's going on. And the first thing I do is I call 311 because I want to see what services there are because I'm worried about this man. And all the person on 311 says is, well, I can send the police if you want. And that's the last thing that I want, right? I would love if we had a system that he could go somewhere safe while he was having that experience, that he could be given um, uh, things that would reduce the harm for him, whether it is clean needles, whether it is something like Narcan that could save his life if he was having an overdose, whether it was something like a uh, fentanyl test strip to make sure that he's not going to take a dose that could kill him. So that way he can stay alive long enough to get to a point where he can make a different decision. Because one thing that I found out in talking to hundreds and hundreds of people in recovery and also actively dealing with their addiction is that a person's life has to facilitate that, right? And that positive things in your life, like having a place to stay, like having food to eat, like having a job, like having connection to community, like having custody of your kids, all of those things are doors out of that addiction place. And the fewer of those things you have, the more isolated you are in your addiction and the longer you'll stay in it. So we need to create doors out for people from that place and keep them alive long enough that they can move through that door when they're ready to. If we start there, right, giving people those kinds of resources and then doing the um, psychological and social work, real social work to rebuild families and communities, then I think we can start to heal some of those wounds and we can get rid of that residue.
What's next for you as you have published this book and it's going around and people are reading it? What are you working on next? What are you looking forward to next for yourself personally or professionally?
Yeah, so I will tell you, this is like an exclusive, that I got an option to develop the book into a documentary. So you will get to see, the folks that you read about in real time. They are all survivors. They all live beautiful lives and do wonderful things in their communities. And so the documentary will reflect that element of the book, which is how we survived. So I'm super excited about that.
I'm excited for When Crack Was King, the documentary. As I was reading it, I was like, yeah, we got to do more with this. I want more people to see it and know the story and understand what's misunderstood about the crack epidemic. Donovan, thank you so very much for joining the 4 Degrees to the Streets podcast. This is season 5. This is one of my favorite conversations to have. When I started reading your book, I texted my friends, I was like, I want to interview this guy on my podcast. And so to have it come true and to have you here with me and interviewing you and having this conversation is literally a goal I set early on. And so I'm very grateful to have you on the show and to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been an absolute pleasure, and I am happy now to be a friend of the pod.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening to the 4 Degrees to the Streets podcast. You can follow us on Instagram at the number 4 Degrees pod or send us an email at 4 Degrees to the Streets pod at gmail.com. And you can find everything going on with Donovan on his website, donovanxramsey.com. Peace out, y'all.
Peace.